Record. Great. So everything is recording now. Thank you everyone for coming. We're going to be doing this workshop today on dialogue and armed conflict. Also, a lot of the things that we're going to talk about can also be in the context of dialogue and mass violence. There are different contexts where we can apply dialogue practices, and so we're just going to be talking particularly about like it's already a very broad context, but we're for example, not going to be talking about dialogue and polarization or dialogue in other situations. So let's get started. So I'm Josh. A lot of you know me. I'm based in Tbilisi, but also often based in Ottawa in Canada. I'm a dialogue facilitator, but also a researcher and a peace building practitioner. And at different times in my life, I've dabbled as a journalist. I also do work with a Canadian NGO called Ottawa Dialogue, which focuses more on track two, which is something we'll talk about rather soon. And also, I do work at the Mediation and Dialogue Research Center in Kiev, in Ukraine, where I mostly help with research, but also in producing different work that has to do with how dialogue and mediation and negotiation practices are applied and have been applied there since 2014, when the armed conflict started. I really like hitchhiking and posing for dogs, and I speak both English and Russian. So that's a little bit about me. So very, very, very briefly, what do we mean when we say dialogue? A lot of you came here today already with that knowledge, and so we're not going to spend too much time on this. I'm not sure, Matt, if I know that in our conversations you had mentioned this kind of like bridge building, kind of context and language, and so if you're curious about what we mean by dialogue, also feel free to answer questions. But hopefully just 5 minutes to briefly go over some definitions. Can I get somebody, a volunteer, to please read this quote? Feel free to unmute yourself and just read it out loud.
I'll be happy to read it.
Thanks, Matt.
Dialogue is a process of genuine interaction through which human beings listen to each other deeply enough to be changed by what they learn. Each makes a serious effort to take others' concerns into her or his own picture, even when disagreement persists. No participant gives up her or his identity, but each recognizes enough of the other's valid human claims that he or she will act differently toward the other.
So this was a definition written by Harold Saunders, who was one of the pioneers of dialogue, especially track two dialogue. We'll get down to like what that is a little bit later, but especially in the fields of like peace building, international relations. But this sounds very, very nice, very, very ideal. But when we have conflicts, this kind of communication really seems unrealistic or naive, or there's a lot of questions about, okay, so how can actually this be implemented when there's so much polarization or when there's so much hostility or things like this. And so when we're talking about dialogue as a practice, we're distinguishing it from other things like negotiation or from even moderation by saying that we can say that there's different ingredients to a dialogue that produces this kind of effect, and we can think about it kind of like the ingredients to a secret sauce, right? So some things that make dialogue different and that we need to make sure that we're doing in a proper way in order for it to work. We're not going to get into all of these different components because again we want to get to how it's applied. But for example, focusing on listening, focusing on telling stories, and when I say stories I mean focusing on our personal experiences rather than like narratives or ideology or theories. Reframing, this means like comparing stories, comparing notes, like I grew up with this story, you grew up with that story, how do we kind of create some kind of common story? People who are doing dialogue, especially their facilitators, they want to create some kind of safe space. And by safe space, we also mean the kind of space where we feel comfortable being vulnerable, even if we know that we're going to hear something that might be uncomfortable to us. So also humanizing the other side, and not just humanization in the sense of not thinking of them as a monster, but not thinking of the other side as just a member of the group of the opposing group. So if I'm part of one ethnic group and another person's part of another ethnic group, I don't just think of this person as one of them, but as a person with a complicated history, and yeah, and their own beliefs. And this last one, beyond head, what I mean is that we're not just brains in a box that speak rationally and talk logically. We're also impacted by our bodies, by our emotions, by our nervous systems, by traumas and things like that. And so dialogue also tries to bring into the conversation the reality that, yeah, like we're affected by different things. And so sometimes we can have this rational, calm conversation and like talk about different arguments, but very often we're scared people who have histories of being hurt, and we also have to be aware of that and include that part of who we are. So again, like we could talk so much about the different facets of dialogue, but this is the kind of practice that we're talking about. And so with these, like we could have a dialogue just with one person and one person, right? Where we're trying to create a space where we can see each other's complexity and listen to each other's stories and try to recognize that the other's needs are legitimate and so on and so forth. We can do that one-on-one with a person. But when we're talking about dialogue as a peace building practice applied to contexts of mass violence or of war, there's a couple extra ingredients that are applied. So first off, it's not just I'm having a conversation one-on-one with somebody. Usually these are group-based events. So it could be from like, I don't know, like 6 to 25 or larger. Some people have dialogues where they try to include even like more than 100 people using certain formats, but usually it's small to medium-sized groups. Usually, people are invited to a dialogue who are affected by a conflict or an issue, or maybe who brings some expertise to the context. So it's not just like we're bringing people together to have a conversation about something. Usually, we're more direct in our recruitment efforts. Third, usually these are facilitated conversations. So again, if we're having a dialogue one-on-one with somebody, there's no facilitator, right? We have to do all the heavy lifting. But often, as in terms of a peace building practice, there's a facilitator who is trained and is able to hold the kind of space that would lead to the kind of dialogue that we saw in this definition. So there's always a lot of work that has to be done in order for it to happen, and facilitators are the ones who are doing that. Although it's important to say that facilitators are also people, and sometimes they're also conflict affected. So it's not just like a neutral party coming in to do it all the time, although we'll talk about that later. Oftentimes, people are trying to figure out the roots of a conflict or of the dispute, trying to analyze causes, triggers, things like this. And so that can also be incorporated into the exercises in the dialogue. Sometimes, but not always, there can also be an element of problem solving. So if people are representatives of certain groups that are there in the dialogue, maybe they're also not just trying to understand each other better, but they're also trying to see if they can come to some kind of understanding of what we should do now, right? So and we'll talk about this also with different formats of dialogue. Some are more aimed towards problem solving, and some are more aimed at mutual understanding or reconciliation or things like this. And then this last one, this is really important, change, right? So we want, like often in peace building dialogue, people are like, one of the goals is that people approach each other in the conflict differently. And also that there's a desire that the dialogue has some kind of impact on the broader context. So any questions so far about what we mean by dialogue? Or is that relatively clear so far? Okay. No questions yet. Also, I see that sometimes people are writing things in the chat. I'm not always able to look at those right away. Sometimes when I take a break, I'm able to see that. So if you have questions that are in the chat, I might not get to them right away, but this happens. So another thing that's important to think about when it comes to a dialogue. So this right here, it's not ice cream. This is it's called a palate cleanser. The palate is the part of the mouth that has to do with taste. And so sometimes if you're having a fancy dinner, you might have one course of the meal, and then you have the palate cleanser, which cleans your mouth so you can properly taste the next course of the meal. I also like to think that dialogue can sometimes act as a palate cleanser in the sense that maybe there are people here in the dialogue that want to work on something together, right? But because of histories of violence, histories of trauma, like their narratives about each other, even if they want to cooperate, like they might not be able to because of their feelings towards each other or what have you. So dialogue is a practice. If we kind of dig down and try to understand each other, understand what our motives are, understand why we believe what we believe, those can act as a palate cleanser, right? So we might have lots of emotional baggage that prevents us from working with somebody else. Sometimes dialogue helps us process that so that we can then move on to collaborating together on something. So sometimes the dialogue isn't just the point, but sometimes we do dialogue in order to kind of clean our emotional baggage so that we can work together on something better. So one example might be if you have obviously this isn't a war context example, but if you have people like a couple who are having a divorce, right? They can start negotiating on who gets rights over the cat or who gets the house. And if they're in a huge conflict, then that negotiation is going to be really hard to do because they might get entrenched into their ideas and or into their positions. But if they have some kind of dialogue first, maybe with a couples therapist, where they remember, yeah, actually this I'm in a conflict with them, but they're a really cool person. I remember why I loved them. Like going through that process first helps the negotiation go much smoother. So again, dialogue is sometimes used as a first step before you move on to something like negotiation or problem solving. So another important thing is the role of the facilitator. So think about the dialogue that you're building, like the concrete conversation with specific people as an aquarium, right? If you have an aquarium, you want to have a certain kind of fish in your aquarium, you're going to put certain things in the aquarium, right? So if you want freshwater fish, you're not going to put salt water, right? Certain fish require different things from their aquarium. And in the same way, if you want a certain kind of result from your dialogue, let's say the result is your fish. You're not just going to put whatever ingredients in there you want. You're going to be planning, you know? So like any complex ecosystem, the result or the fish that you will have depends on the choices that you make as a facilitator, right? So very often, many of us, especially when we're starting to facilitate dialogues, we kind of do it in whatever way we can, but it's important to think about, okay, we want to plan our dialogue and shape it in a certain way so that we have the kind of conversation that we need to have. So later we're going to show you examples about different choices you can make as a facilitator and what kinds of results or what kinds of like if you think about a conflict, right? There's a conflict, and there might be different types of peace that you might work towards depending on your priorities. And we'll talk about some examples of that. But again, like any kind of peace or result requires choices, and so this metaphor with the aquarium is just to say that we can be intentional about what choices we make so as to make more likely a certain kind of result, although we can never guarantee it. So in the end, what dialogue can do, it can change our view of or approach the conflict, the situation of the other person or side. It can help us recognize the other person's needs, emotion, and story. It can transform relationships. After we can recognize the other side's needs, grievances, and legitimacy they have a right to exist, that they're just as important as ours. Again, it can make other tasks easier, like debate or negotiation or problem solving. And it can also generate creative ideas, innovative solutions, next steps, plans, roadmaps, if that's what you do as a facilitator, right? Some facilitators want to include something that creates some kind of sense of next steps. Some people don't know. Again, it depends on what your goals are. But what dialogue can't do, if bombs are already falling, it can't stop those bombs from falling. So if there's mass violence that's happening like at this moment, like dialogue might not be the right tool to stop it as soon as possible, right? So we don't say that we can't say that dialogue can do everything. Neither can dialogue change the mind of everyone in the wider group. So if you have a transformative encounter with one member of the other side, it doesn't mean that the whole other side is transformed, right? Sometimes also people can be transformed in a dialogue and they go back to their respective sides and their sides pressure them and they can sometimes take a step back and go back to those old mindsets. So sometimes people go to a dialogue and it's so successful, they're filled with such hope, but they have to also realize that that's just the first step, right? And that we can't expect entire groups to change overnight. Nor can dialogue transform deeply rooted structural injustice. So if there are injustices in certain societies, Like dialogue can motivate people to mobilize themselves to work on them, but it needs that extra step of mobilization. It's not going to just happen because of the dialogue. You can't convince other people to dialogue against their will, nor stop bad actors from manipulating the conflict or manipulating the dialogue. So you have to also take care as to who you recruit. Nor can it repair cities, clean the water, or bring back the dead. So again, a major element here is having proper expectations of what dialogue can do and what it can't do, knowing that dialogue can inspire people or clear the emotional baggage so that people can work on these important things. Yeah, so that's what we mean when we say dialogue. Are there any questions about what dialogue is before we move forward? Dasha.
Yeah, maybe it's not really a question about the dialogue, but like back to your point that it cannot change the deep structural injustice. Is this like your statement for all, or because I think to me dialogue is actually a way to change the deeply structural injustice in a way. That's how I got into that topic, maybe.
Yeah, I think let me just clarify what I mean. I mean, like if you have a group of 30 people in your dialogue and they are all significantly transformed, that doesn't automatically change structural injustices in the broader society. If there's a structural injustice within that group or within that community, it might, right? Like if you have a community where there's toxic tendencies. And if all those people are in that room and you have something transforming, then yes, then it can, right? But it's just to say that if there's like racism or classism or gender-based violence, right? Like if those 30 people are transformed, it doesn't transform society immediately. There has to be an extra step between a successful dialogue and societal change. And we'll be getting more into that. This involves something called transfer. Does that answer your question? Okay, good, good. Also, yeah, if anyone also has anything else to add as we go along, like not just a question, but also kind of a comment, because many people in this room have experience as facilitators or dialogue conveners. So I'm sure that we can benefit from your wisdom as well.
Well, I mean, I have a thought,
Mhm.
but
Yeah.
I don't think that's something that we can quickly just address in a moment. But I'd like to bring it up nonetheless.
Mhm.
So a lot of what I'm seeing in my day-to-day life where hateful discourse is going on is just on social media, right? Like you just need to go on Facebook or Instagram or whatnot, or in YouTube comments, you're going to see people fighting with each other about whatever the topic du jour is. And I'm wondering if dialogue facilitation, mediation techniques can be a tool in that space to dissolve disagreements, to establish more peace, establish
Mhm.
more understanding. And if you're aware of things that have been done in that space. But as I
Mhm.
said, it's kind of a tangent. I don't know if it's really relevant to what we're discussing today. But hey, I figured I might as well bring it up.
Yeah, like one thing
Hmm.
that's maybe not entirely relevant to the context you're talking about is, but also like some people host online dialogues, right? Online facilitated dialogues, which also kind of like creates a certain space for different kind of communication. But if we're talking about like comments on Facebook or like chats or things like this, like there's no facilitator. And if a facilitator can try to facilitate, but it's not with the consent of the people that are there. And so it's different. But I talked about earlier how there's a kind of dialogue where it's just one person, and there are techniques that you can use when engaging online and offline to try to make a conversation more dialogue-like. We're not going to be talking about the techniques today, but there's definitely a lot that's there that people can try. But online is always harder because some people are just trolls, and you can't always know when somebody is sincere. Dasha.
Agreed. Yeah. You don't even know if
Yeah,
you don't even know if they're real, if they're being
yeah,
paid,
yeah,
instigate and whatnot. That's true.
exactly.
Yep. Okay.
I'll just read out what Masha wrote in the chat. She says, I still can't understand what makes dialogue special or different from other practices. Does it have some special structure or questions or something else?
Yeah.
Could you?
Hello, Masha. So like there, this is kind of what we can't really get into too much today, because like we want to talk about like kind of how it's applied. But this when we're talking about these aspects, I don't know, Masha, if you kind of saw like our like some of this before you came in, but like focusing on particular elements to create a certain kind of space like this. So this is what separates dialogue from, say, debate, or from negotiation, or from even moderation, deciding who can or cannot speak. There's some elements that definitely overlap with mediation. But again, there's we can do a whole other workshop about all of these different aspects of like what is dialogue and how like the different components work. Like suffice to say that there is different people have different definitions. But like I think I'm quite convinced of what makes dialogue different from other communication practices, but it overlaps with a lot of other stuff, which isn't really a detailed answer to your question, Masha, unfortunately, and we don't have time to get into that. But happy to get into that next time we see each other as well, or to do a different workshop on that. Sorry for the cop-out answer, but it's funny. Like this presentation is normally like the second in like, so the first, like if I'm doing like a series of presentations, the first one is like, what is dialogue, where we get into all of this stuff. And this is the second one where it's like, how is dialogue applied in armed conflicts and war? And Tata has seen both of those. So she has the master plan in her head, but unfortunately for everyone else, these were given out of order. Great. Okay. So let's move forward. So how what does dialogue look like in a situation of armed conflict? Like it's very easy to think about dialogue, maybe when people have a disagreement, but it's not too heated. But when it comes to war and trauma and stuff, there needs to be a lot of extra care put in. So just as a disclaimer, I know that not everybody here has the power or the position to make an impact on whether armed conflict stops or slows down. But I just want to talk about how dialogue has been used in the past in order to work towards those goals, and whether there are roles that we can play in that process. So again, not to say that we're all super people who can stop wars, but more just like what are different things we can think about when we're planning our dialogues, if we want to be facilitators to have a greater impact in conflicts that we're involved in. So three kind of extra things that I want to focus on when we're talking about dialogue and armed conflict. Like one is goal, one is application, and one is called transfer. And we'll get into these definitions as we move along. So we have this AI generated weird picture of this car on the roads. It kind of looks like what a road trip on mushrooms would look like. But if we're kind of using this metaphor of like a car that's driving from one place to another, the first thing you need to know is where you're going, right? And it's the same thing when we're facilitators. If we want to plan a dialogue, we want to start with the end in mind. Sometimes we just do a dialogue, not caring where we go, and that's okay too. But often when we're involved in a conflict, there's something like we want something out of it, right? Like we want to move from a state of conflict to a state of peace, although that the kind of peace that we're looking for, it might be different. So I'm going to use an example of the wars in the Balkans in the 1990s during the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. So here is a map of the former Yugoslavia divided into different countries, and you'll see in the middle this area that's like a triangle that is covered, that's surrounded by this pink marker. That is the current country of Bosnia, and most of the other colors are ethnic groups. And you'll see that in Bosnia, there is a mix of different ethnic groups. So there's Serbs and Bosniak Muslims and Croatians. And there was a very brutal war there that ended in, I think, 1995. And so let's put on our hats as facilitators and think about if this war is going on and it's quite brutal. There were elements of genocide and ethnic cleansing. There was a big siege of Sarajevo, the capital. So if we are peace builders in 1992, let's say, like 3 years before the war ends, and we want to design a dialogue that wants to have some kind of impact on this war, we have to think about first, what kind of result do we want to work for? So there's different kinds of goals, right? So one type of goal might be, okay, so we want a ceasefire. So an immediate freeze of the front line after 2 years of war and no other political changes, right? Maybe we want so some people consider the Serbs as the aggressors in this war. Maybe we want to keep fighting until there's a total Serb loss, um, even though it's 8 years of war, which means that there's no resulting Kosovo war in 2000, no ethnic cleansing or domination of Serbs in Republika Srpska. Republika Srpska is one part of Bosnia. So basically, the war goes longer, but there's like total victory over the aggressor, right? Maybe another goal is their version of peace is giving ethnic groups autonomy over the history they teach, right? Because they're different ethnic groups and they all have different kinds of narratives of history. But maybe another kind of peace for somebody else is that there's a common narrative of history accepted across all groups in Bosnia, right? So like the first two visions of peace are military, right? But then these other ones, these aren't militarily at all. They're about like, do we have some kind of social cohesion? Do we have some kind of unified history idea? Maybe one person's type of peace is segregation, even inside of towns. So, everything is so tense that it's better just to separate the different ethnic groups. Maybe for one person, peace looks like the restructuring the three states into micro-administered regions that resist the worst tendencies of capitalism or neoliberalism, right? That might be somebody's vision of peace. Or maybe somebody says war is not declared over until all forms of violence are stopped, including along gendered, racial, sexual, and religious lines, right? So one question is it possible to have all of these at once?
Absolutely not,
Why?
because some of these are contradictory or at least not, they don't seem compatible.
Yeah, exactly. 100%, right? Like, if you have different peace builders who are advocating for different goals, they're going to be working against each other, right? For one person, they want a ceasefire as soon as possible to limit the loss of life. For one person, they're like, okay, they're okay for the war going on longer, so long as there's less possibility later of like another war coming back. So again, like if you are a dialogue practitioner, depending on what goal you have, you're going to be inviting different people to your dialogue. You're going to have a different kind of methodology. You're going to want to produce a different kind of result, right? So all of this is to say that the kind of peace that you want like demands that you make a choice about certain things, and not all types of peace are mutually compatible. And very often you'll have people fighting each other who are both working for peace, but working towards a very, very different kind of peace. So whenever there's some kind of intervention in an armed conflict or even other kinds of conflict, it's good if we have an idea of what peace looks like for us and what it is that we want to work towards. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so there's another workshop that I give about like designing dialogue processes, and we get more into, okay, like for this goal, what would this process look like? And for this goal, what would this process look like? So we're not going to get too deep into this today. All of this is to say, yeah, again, like peace requires choices. And we just design our dialogues trying to keep in mind the kind of peace we're striving to build. Again, we're returning to this metaphor of the aquarium. If we want a certain kind of fish, we need to build a certain kind of aquarium. So we have to learn what kinds of settings produce what kinds of fish, or what kinds of ecosystems allow certain kinds of fish to live. And so what kind of ecosystem, what kinds of requirements would help bring our version of peace into the world and allow it to live sustainably. So again, this isn't something that we can just kind of like pull out of thin air right now, but just that if we want to engage with this, we have to think about what we want and what demands does our vision of peace make of us. And oftentimes the choice is inevitable. If we want to work on one thing, we can't work on something else. So it doesn't mean, though, that our kind of dialogue is going to be mutually different kinds of dialogue with different kinds of goals can work together. So I really like this diagram. I know Masha has seen this before. This is an example of different kinds of dialogues that might take place in the United States with regards to racial democracy. So the spectrum on the bottom is like opponents and advocates of multicultural democracy in the States. And the five different speech bubbles, those are different groups. So on the far left-hand side, you have violent extremist groups. So you could say like white supremacists, for example. Then you have conservative supporters of the status quo, then liberals, then you have progressives, and then you have active supporters of M4BL is Movement for Black Lives. So this is about Black Lives Matter. So the writer was a supporter of Black Lives Matter. So it's kind of within that framework. I know some people have problems with Black Lives Matter as a movement for other reasons, but just for the sake of the exercise, let's just think about it like this way. And then the four different kind of like half moons above, these are different types of dialogue. So the purple dialogue is dialogue for political depolarization. So this is about reducing partisan hostility, like reducing the hostility and anger that different groups have to each other, because that anger and that hostility and the polarization can make our brains do weird things. So we try to lower the polarization so that we can work together on something. Because when we're polarized, as we see in the United States, like government doesn't work properly, lots of other problems come up. So this is depolarization. But because of that, your facilitator isn't going to take a strong stance on certain political issues, right? Maybe they're going to be more neutral. But then let's say you have between liberal supporters of the status quo and active supporters for Black Lives Matter, these are dialogue for addressing systemic injustices. So this is where there's an agenda. So maybe in this kind of dialogue, people are going to talk about, oh, like white privilege, what can we do about that, right? So there's like an ideological agenda, and the people are trying to bring the liberals closer to the progressive side, right? So it's a kind of dialogue that's meant to convince. Then there's a dialogue for coalition building between progressives and supporters of Black Lives Matter, which is everyone already agrees on their values. And so the dialogue is about building strategies to work together as activists. And then the red one is dialogue for disengagement, which might be between conservatives and liberals and the white supremacist groups, where they're basically trying to have dialogue with white supremacists to de-radicalize them and convince them to abandon the movement. And these are all different types of dialogues, and their methodologies wouldn't work in other types, right? So in the depolarization dialogue, it has to be value neutral because there's political diversity. But like neutrality in the dialogue for coalition building wouldn't work because we should have a common values, right? So the facilitator should kind of push their agenda. So this is just like one example of how there are different types of dialogue, each with different goals, but they can still work together in a larger ecosystem for peace. So just because you have one goal doesn't, and if you're a facilitator with a certain style, you might not be invited to facilitate all types of dialogue. But even if you can't facilitate one type of dialogue, it doesn't mean that your dialogue can't also work together in a broader picture with other dialogues. Any questions about this? Masha. I see you have a hand, Masha. I don't hear you though. You'll write the question. Perfect. Great. Anyone have any other questions or comments while Masha is writing the question? Okay. I think it's also interesting. Some facilitators are able to facilitate different kinds of processes. So for example, I got my start in methodology for political depolarization. But as I've gone on, I've also learned strategies and techniques for facilitating other types. So it's always cool to be able to facilitate different types of dialogue. But for some people, it's harder. Like if somebody is a person from a marginalized community, it might be harder for them to facilitate a dialogue with white supremacists, right? So even certain facilitators might have limitations. Norun, where would you say that the Nansen dialogues we've been part of, what kind of dialogue would those be?
Thank you. Yeah, I find this model really fascinating, and I'm thinking about that. I think maybe this depolarization is something that we would go into, and also, but we are not as conscious as you about these differences, I think, because we tend to apply basically the same methodology in different cases and in different for different purposes. But I think this what to say to be clear about our role as a facilitator and the neutrality, or what we call the multipartiality, that we are not like having siding with any of the parties. That is an important principle, of course, in all our work, but also it creates some kind of dilemma sometimes when we have a very strong, what to say, opinion about the whole issue. Then of course it can be challenging. But yeah, but I will. I think I have to think more about this one, because I think also this coalition building is really. Sometimes we are working on that. Absolutely, because it depends on the needs in the groups that we're working with, actually. So then we could, I think, for maybe those two that we are working mostly on. Yeah.
Perfect. I do have to say that there was one type of dialogue that I've seen, at least in the academic literature. They call it intergroup dialogue, although almost all dialogues are intergroup dialogues, so I don't really like the name. But they call it intergroup dialogue, and they take sides. For example, they believe that there is white privilege. If we're talking about race, like, okay, there's white privilege, there's marginalization of people of color in the United States. Like, there are very particular stances that they take on political issues, and the facilitator like creates a space where people can explore those issues through a particular lens. So you wouldn't invite necessarily like a conservative to that dialogue who doesn't necessarily believe those things, because or if the conservative does come, they would expect that the facilitator takes the side of the people who believe that there is white privilege and we need to do something about it. And the point is also to kind of like help people become aware of their white privilege. So like that's a very, very different dialogue tradition than the one that I observed at the Nansen Center. Definitely. Tata, I see your hand.
Yes, I have a question to myself and to us. Maybe I'm thinking about this different specialization of a facilitator and what is it based on. So on the one hand, it seems that in general, the job is kind of more universal, like you come to different groups and at least from my experience, and you start learning, preparing for the dialogue process, and it depends, like just dive into different topics. And I'm thinking if there are some specific skills that you need to have in this or that type of dialogue work, or it is more based on interest, like, okay, I'm specialized in this kind of dialogues just because I like them more because of my personal motivation or whatever, or is it really about knowledge and skills and training and so on? So this is one question I'm thinking about. And I liked very much the comment about neutrality. And I was also thinking if this, it seems to be as a position that I used to take for granted, like, yes, that the facilitator should have this neutrality position. And the last years, I start slowly arguing with myself about this. Is it really always like this? But again, this is maybe for just to share a question, and maybe we have time for discussion later. Thank you.
Yeah. I think like there's so many different ways to do dialogue that I definitely don't want to say that people should be doing XYZ, but that these are the questions that often require reflection if we want to make some kind of intervention. And so Masha asked a really good question in the chat. So how can you be sure, how can you as a dialogue facilitator be sure of the goal? Doesn't it kind of take agency from the parties of the conflict? How do you check if the goal you have is good enough for all the participants? And if yes, how? I wonder, how can I be sure that I have got the right to decide on the goal? And what if I haven't, or the participants think that I don't? So fantastic question. So in terms of, does it take away the agency from the parties of the conflict? It can, absolutely. So if you are going in trying to do an intervention saying, I'm looking towards this kind of peace, and so I'm going to build this kind of process, you're 100% setting the agenda. It might not just be you as a facilitator, maybe it's also the donor, right? The donor wants this kind of dialogue, and then it's the donor takes away agency, like takes the agency, like in general, and maybe you have less agency and the participants have less agency to decide the agenda, right? There's a type of dialogue called transformative dialogue, which actually was written about by a colleague of some folks at the Nansen Center. His name is Eric Clevin, and he wrote some articles and even a book recently. And I actually was able to write a chapter in that book about Ukraine. Just a plug for the book called Transformative Dialogue. And their approach is that the convener and the facilitator should not decide the goals. For them, it should be, the goal should be decided by the parties. Even like, for example, the facilitator might try to bring the sides together and they don't want to be together. In that framework, that's wrong with the facilitator to try to do that. It should be the sides of the right of the sides to decide what kind of engagement should be, what their goals should be. And so that's another kind of facilitation, right? Where you either you work with the sides to decide on the goals. I think that when there is violence and war, I know, for example, for me, if I think that there's like violence is happening, maybe I might be like, again, we make choices depending on what our priorities are, right? Maybe for somebody, like we need to have a ceasefire as soon as possible, and all the other questions can be decided afterwards. And some people have a problem with that kind of approach. Again, sometimes there isn't a right answer. It depends on what your priorities are. So you might choose transformative dialogue if your priorities are elevating the agency of the participants and the parties. But if you have a different priority, you might choose a different approach. So again, it's like, again, like in big bright letters, it's all about choices, right? And it's good to be aware of our choice and our priority. Because if we aren't aware of that, it might be like a ghost in the room that's affecting the process without us knowing it, right? So these are all major questions to be thinking about. But thank you, Masha, for the question, because it's a really important point. Okay, let's keep going. We can come back to this and other questions a bit later. So yeah, okay. So this is a picture of breakfast, right? What makes this breakfast really cool is that there's lots of different parts to it, right? And in the same way, all these different types of dialogue, it doesn't just, we don't only have to eat beans or mushrooms for breakfast. We can have different foods on our plate, and it's more interesting in that way. So we can have different types of dialogues with different goals that all try to create a different kind of like add up to something that's bigger than the sum of its parts. Okay, so that's about goal. The second is application, which is about when and where do we apply like dialogue practices. So if thinking about the goal is where do we want to go, application is the road to get there. Like where does this road go through, and like how do we like what does it look like? So before we talk about that, I want you to meet Luna. Luna is my llama friend. But there's a problem. Luna is sick. Without surgery, recovery, and a healthy lifestyle, they're going to die. So this is obviously a problem, right? Like if I'm really invested in making sure that Luna like gets better. So there are different things that I can think about if I want Luna to survive. One is llama surgery. So there's something wrong, and we need to make like something happen really fast in order to like save a life. Number two is llama recovery. So there was surgery, and now they need to recover to get back to full strength. And then the third part is long-term llama health. So obviously, this is a metaphor for something. So we're not actually talking about llama health. What we're talking about is the health of a society, like within the context of war, right? So the llama surgery, we could call it peacemaking. So there's a war, and we want the war to end with a peace deal, with a peace agreement. So like there's a big problem, and we do something to intervene to make that problem non-lethal, right? So we could consider that like peacemaking, like getting the deal sealed to stop the violence. This is like surgery, right? And then recovery after surgery, this is something that we call reconciliation. So even once we've done the peace deal, people are still really hurt. There's the impact of war. There's the impact of trauma. There are these divided communities, and so reconciliation is kind of like recovery from the war, right? And then we have something called peace building, which is the kinds of interventions that we do to basically upkeep the health of the society, so that we don't fall back into violence. So Norun might laugh at this picture because actually it was taken at one of the Nansen events in Lillehammer in 2008 when I was there. There was like a Dialogue City event. But yeah, and so does the difference between these three different phases, we can think about it as phases of intervention to a conflict. Did the differences make sense? One is intervening to stop a war, intervening to stop violence. The second is helping people to recover from violence and to reconcile with each other, or to reconcile with the situation, or to reconcile with the experience of like trauma in their own bodies, right? And then third, peace building are just like it's like brushing your teeth. It's the regular things that you do to prevent getting sick, or the regular things that we do in order to make sure that a war doesn't happen in the future. Does this division make sense? Okay, I'm not seeing or hearing any comments, so I'm going to assume that it does. But if you have a question, please answer it, ask it now, because we're going to be using this framework through the rest of the presentation. Okay, great. So there's basically different phases of a conflict or conflict resolution require different kinds of dialogue. The methodology is different, the style of facilitation is different, and the result is different. So first, we're going to be talking about peacemaking dialogue. So these are dialogues that aim to influence a peace process or negotiation. Oftentimes, it's so like there's negotiation, which isn't quite dialogue. Like a negotiation is making a deal. If you're negotiating in a peace process, you don't necessarily have a facilitator asking people how they feel. Oh, I see something in the chat. Masha says, it looks like peacemaking is for negative peace, peace building for positive, and reconciliation for everything in between. Yeah, like peacemaking that's for like creating like a negative peace. Sorry for those who aren't sure what negative and positive peace means. We don't have time to get into that theory. But yeah, so peace building, I would say reconciliation is also about positive peace. So peacemaking is more negative peace, reconciliation and peace building is for positive peace. That's my understanding, although there are exceptions and it's more nuanced than that. So to get back to peacemaking dialogue, maybe you have, so like if you have Putin and Zelensky, or like Putin and Trump, which is more realistic right now, you don't have a facilitator asking Putin how he feels and Trump how he feels, right? Like that's not how negotiations work usually. So maybe you have some kind of dialogue that's happening at the same time as the negotiations, where that's trying to influence the negotiations. So maybe it's informally gathering influential participants on either side of the conflict to discuss possible ways forward. Often this kind of dialogue, so when we talk about track 2 dialogue, this is often what we're talking, in many cases, this is what we're talking about, but not always. Usually this kind of dialogue is repeated over time with the same or a lightly changing group of participants. So an example here in the picture is the shaking hands at the Oslo Accords, which was a deal that was struck between the Israeli government and the Palestinian Liberation Organization. That took place after possibly over a decade of informal dialogues that were trying to build the steps towards that peace process. Obviously, it wasn't it wasn't a perfect peace process. There are many elements that you could say failed from that, but there was a peace deal that was preceded by dialogues that meant to decide what should be on the agenda, what should the negotiators know, what are different pitfalls and traps and things like this. But it's meant to get people to the deal. Reconciliation dialogue is very, very different. It aims to heal broken relationships. So instead of trying to figure out like where can there be moments, like where can there be compromise, how can we make the deal, how do we create the proper conditions for a better negotiation, reconciliation is about truth-telling, accepting responsibility for cycles of violence, restorative justice or transitional justice, often taking place post-violence. Tata, I see your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that maybe the target groups of these processes are also different.
Completely
Like
different.
for the peacemaking, it is the decision makers, the politicians,
Yeah.
maybe they don't have any personal process, emotional whatsoever. And when we're speaking about reconciliation, this is more about the communities which suffered from the decisions of other people.
Yeah.
And so this is like really different different groups that we work with. I think this is important here to mention. Thank you.
100%. Thank you for drawing attention to that. And yeah, so oftentimes also the facilitators who are doing this kind of thing are, or they should be qualified to deal with trauma, especially group trauma. And there might not necessarily be like a result or a point that's coming out of it. It might just be like creating dialogue as a space for people to process mass violence against them. It also might be about, there's a town, like for example, we take the Balkans, right? So in Bosnia, there might be a village where there are Bosniak Muslims and Serbs, or Croats and Serbs, or Croats and Bosniak Muslims. And they might live in the town, but they might be completely segregated, right? Reconciliation dialogue might also be about trying to involve as many people as possible in a process that gives them space to try to figure out how they want to be neighbors for the rest of their lives. You know, how do we live together? Oftentimes here, there's also an element of trying to figure out the past. How do we feel about the past? Can we find a common narrative to think about the past? So there's a lot of different components to this, but it's usually how do we deal with the after effects of violence in communities that were affected by that? So again, dialogue is dialogue that's at this stage is about this. Masha, I see your hand, so I guess there's a question in the chat. But why is it so? When and where can we ask the decision makers how they feel, and for truth telling and acting responsibly? So in the peacemaking dialogue, sometimes the same group is in the dialogue for a number of years, and the facilitator is also asking them about how they feel, right? So with this group of Russian-speaking facilitators that is kind of hosting this conversation here, last month we had we watched a film about dialogues that contributed to the end of apartheid in South Africa. It's called Endgame. And it shows a years-long dialogue process where people were, like kind of invited to explore, like how do they feel? What is it that their hopes and dreams are for the future? And these are things that people that the facilitator can use in order to try to get people to get closer to signing the deal or to having better negotiations. So it's not like all of, so if we go back to the secret sauce of dialogue over here, a focus on listening, telling stories, safe space, engaging with different parts of our bodies, our nervous systems, humanizing the other side, comparing notes. All of these things are true in all of these different types of dialogues, right? The difference is how are they applied, with what goal, what kinds of participants are involved, and what kinds of things do we choose to spend time on, right? So also, Masha, you asked about truth-telling and accepting responsibility. This is something that's really hard because maybe, especially if you're involving officials informally in a dialogue that's meant to influence the negotiation, maybe these officials aren't ready to accept responsibility or to tell the truth. They want to find a way to get the peace deal, and maybe also to find a way to keep power while doing so. And maybe telling truth or accepting responsibility is gonna like make them less likely to want to engage in the peace process. So there are different really hard factors that are involved with this. There is a whole field of something called transitional justice, which is about truth telling and accepting responsibility, even for people in power. But this is usually after there's been the wars ended and there's a transition, like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, or different commissions in Rwanda or in Bosnia, like in Rwanda after the genocide, Bosnia after the war. So like there are different like people like different practices think about this at different times, but sometimes some people don't want to accept truth or tell the truth or accept responsibility. They might want to pragmatically think, okay, like let's not worry about that. Let's make the deal. So it depends, depending on the context. But that aspect is front and center with reconciliation, whereas making the deal is front and center for peacemaking. Learning how to process and live with the past and figure out how to live with people on the other side in the future, that's at the core of reconciliation dialogue. So peace building dialogue is it's the most vague of them all, because it's basically like it aims to address problems ahead of time in order to prevent violence or future violence, like to prevent future violence, either the return to violence or to stop violence from happening in a preventative sense. So this can basically, there are so many different things that can qualify as peace building dialogue. You could have dialogue between journalists to try to create common practices for how you report on conflicts or on polarization. You might have people just in one town who want to better deal with people who have different political views. You might have liberals and conservatives in the United States talking about issues like abortion or gun control or things like this. You can work with particular sectors like journalism or municipal leaders or religious leaders. It could take place once. It could be like with the same group of people. It could be multiple times with different people or the same people. Like so many different things can be peace building dialogue, but the whole thing is this is a process that isn't responding necessarily to like immediate violence, trying to stop it or heal. It's more like how all the different kinds of dialogue that's meant to deal with tensions in a way that they don't erupt into violence in the future. And so this, like the types of practices here are really, really wide. So I can't just tell you this is what peace building dialogue looks like because it's quite broad. Tata.
I was just thinking that maybe this part could be called world building, like because it is more about in what world do we or community or society want to, or societies want to live after something happened, like so that we're not that much, we're still keep in mind what happened and so on, but we're I think more important where we are now and how we can move forward, what future, what world we want to live together. Because I'm thinking that very often this thinking too much or too focused on what happened sometimes does not allow to go forward. So that was just came to my mind. Thank you.
Thank you. So with all of these, like peacemaking, reconciliation, peace building, this is just one model of how we can think about it that depends on at what point in the conflict do we intervene? Do we intervene when it's really hot? Do we intervene before it gets hot? Or do we intervene after the hot phase is over, right? And we need to pick up the pieces. And the methodologies and approach and the goals might be very different. We can also think about our interventions in terms of the tracks. This is a very famous piece of peace building theory. Some of you might have seen this before. The different tracks in this pyramid are about what groups of people are we wanting to work with. Track one, this is top leadership. This is decision makers. This is Putin and Zelensky. Or like UN negotiators or different things like this. Usually dialogue does not take place at this level. Usually it's negotiation that takes place at this level because it's very public. People have public faces, and it's very, very difficult to have the kind of dialogue with the facilitator that would get into all these different elements because it's really hard to do that when it's so public facing. Track 1.5 are the same people in track 1, but in secret. So track 1 is the public negotiations, the public peace process. Track 1.5 is the hidden dialogues or negotiations that's taking place. So for example, the Oslo Accord here that was done between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Authority, in public, they're saying we're not dealing with the other side, but in reality, there was a track 1.5 dialogue where they were in negotiation, like when they were in dialogue with each other, trying to figure out if there was any kind of deal that they could both agree with. Track 2 is influential people, often who have the ear of the people in track 1. So these can be like academics, public intellectuals, religious leaders, regional power leaders, things like this. So in the case of South Africa, as we saw in the movie, those of us who watched the movie together, it was like people who weren't the decision makers, but people who were close to decision makers who were having a dialogue over a number of years. And in those dialogues, they created enough trust and mutual understanding that they were able to think of what possible peace deal, we're thinking also about peacemaking here, what kind of peace deal or what kind of transition would be acceptable to both sides. And because they weren't track 1, they had more flexibility to do it, to kind of dream of new ideas. And then they tried to find a way to transfer those ideas to people at track 1 as to influence the official negotiations. So track 2 is like influential leaders who still aren't at the top. And then there's track 3, which is the grassroots level. So it could be like community leaders, like regional religious leaders, NGOs, teachers, journalists. Like track 3 is like kind of the masses in this way. So for example, if I was going to do like if there was a village after a war and I wanted to do like reconciliation dialogue, I would be working at like track 3. If I wanted to influence like a peace process that was really kind of stuck, maybe I might try to organize a track 2 that would be designed in a way that could influence track 1, right? And peace building you could do at any of these different tracks. And these are all just different examples. You could there's some people that actually try to do a track 2 in order to influence track 3. So like maybe you have journalistic leaders that try to, or maybe you have a dialogue involving all the like people who are the heads of social media companies like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, and you have like a track 2 with them to try to create some kind of better algorithms or policies to stop polarization. And in that way, they're trying to influence track 3, like all the people who use their platforms. So this is all of this is to say that there are different levels of people think about different levels of society that have influence on each other. And depending on what group you want to intervene on, your recruitment is going to be different. Your methodology might be different. So this is another thing to think about when designing your dialogue. Does this make sense? I'm not saying that this model is perfect. There's lots of problems with it, but it's one of those models that keeps coming up again and again when we talk about peace building interventions. Okay. So another way of looking at tracks is not who's most influential, who's not influential, but what are different elements of society, right? So like business, religion, educators, private citizens, donors. So some people have dialogues within certain sectors to try to have like maybe not work with all of society, but work with a particular element of that. So this is a different model with the tracks, although I would say that it's less influential than this one. Like not many people talk about it, but we kind of also, like I mentioned it because this is another way of thinking about it. Okay, so Dasha.
Can I ask about this one? Because I see this one for the first time and I'm very confused. Like, is there any is there any point for the color or the inner circle, or like, can you elaborate a little bit, or the color and the
Yeah, I don't know actually.
Okay.
I haven't studied this too much. Like the track 9, media and public opinion in the inner circle. Like, I don't know if this means something special or media has to do with everything, but I think also like business has to do with everything, and religion has to do with everything. Like I'm not very fluent in this model, so I can't really talk about the nuances. But it's more just to say that some people think about their intervention in terms of like the level of influence, and some people think about it in terms of the sectors that they want to work with, and some people specialize in certain sectors. I'm sure there's much more to be said about this, but I'm definitely not the one to say it. Okay, and then this is super, 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 super important. The third element and the last element that we're going to talk about is what we call transfer. So you have your goal, the road exists, but now you have to get yourself down the road. So it's like the car that takes you from one point to another. So by transfer, let's go back to this metaphor of the aquarium. Let's say you, as the facilitator, you build this perfect aquarium, and the fish that you wanted to appear have appeared. You have the kind of results. Maybe you want everyone to cry and hug each other and realize they're all human, and like you have all of those different beautiful things. There's a problem here, is that this beautiful ecosystem that you've created as a facilitator, this like beautiful encounter, people, your participants are transformed, but it's all happening inside your aquarium. What about the rest of the sea? Right? So you have success inside your dialogue, but what does that mean for the conflict at large? For some people, that's enough, right? Maybe some people, it's they want to work with a particular group of people and they want to transform the relationships in that group. 100% completely legitimate. Some people want their dialogue to have an impact on the broader society. So the question is, this is from a movie from the 90s. I don't know. Does everybody know Free Willy? So it's a story about like a whale who lives in an aquarium, but then he like goes into the sea, right? So we want, like many of us as peace building like facilitators want our fish to leave the aquarium and go into the sea and affect the sea. Does that make sense? So transfer is about the process. How does our fish leave the aquarium and go into the sea and make an impact in the sea? So we talked about all the different things that dialogue can do, like changing our approach to conflict, transforming relationships, making tasks easier, recognizing that the other's needs are legitimate. But again, like how do these goals impact like the conflicts that are around us, right? So let's go back to the metaphor of my sick llama, right? Imagine that the llama is sick and we want to intervene, but like we aren't the ones. There's a question, or there's a comment in the chat. So Natasha, I'm looking at your question. So there's a question about so she hadn't, like when we were talking, there was an association with, in terms of negotiations with within conflicts where there was like terrorists involved. So there's like Nordost and like Beslan in Russia, and there were negotiators who were doctors and journalists, and these were groups that had significance for the terrorists. Is it possible to compare these situations? If I'm correctly understanding the question, do you mean like picking certain people that would be considered legitimate for the conflict parties? Or I don't know if you can clarify your question.
Извини, пожалуйста, я буду говорить на русском, потому что
Да.
на английском я неправильно, скорее всего, донесу мысль.
Мгм.
Я имела в виду, что можно ли сравнивать вот, ну, как сказать, тему, про которую ты говоришь, это про военные конфликты, с
Мгм.
ситуацией, когда идут переговоры с террористами. Это, я понимаю, что это менее затяжной, ну, в смысле, это процесс, который в более короткий срок происходит,
Мгм.
и есть определенное, ну, как бы давление ситуации, вот,
Мгм.
но при этом кажется, что там тоже есть некоторые, ну, последовательность и люди, и посредники, которых готовы принимать в качестве переговорщиков. То есть я имею в виду, что можно ли сравнить вот эти ситуации, и, может быть, что в них есть действительно подходящего из того, что ты говоришь, вот, к ним.
Yeah. Do you mean in the context of this?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Natasha's question was about, okay, so like this is in the context of like countries where track one is like a country's president or their diplomats. She was asking about smaller scale conflicts. So for example, terrorists have taken a school hostage, and there are negotiators who are like going in and trying to deal with them. 100% yes. So for example, there was one case where I was invited to help facilitate a dialogue in a city called Calgary, where there was an issue, there was a conflict between the municipal government, the city government, and one neighborhood. This neighborhood was poorer than the other neighborhoods in Calgary. And so in this case, track one isn't the Prime Minister of Canada. Track one is the mayor. Track one is the decision makers. Track one is the city apparatus. It's the city decision-making process. Track three would be like people in the neighborhood who are like living there, right? So you can adapt this model of like influence to a number of different contexts where there is, say, a decision maker. There are influential people who might have the ear of the decision maker or who have some kind of influence in general, and then people who are working in the grassroots. And you can apply this dialogue model to those cases. 100%. I would agree with that. Does that answer the question, Natasha?
Да, спасибо.
Great. Excellent. Okay. Thank you for the question. Okay. So to return to this idea of transfer, so yeah, again, if there's some kind of change that's happening inside of our dialogue, we want to make the change happen elsewhere. So to go back to the Lama who is sick, we might be conflict resolution professionals, right? Or we might be people who care about the Lama. We want to, like, maybe we know what the Lama needs to take, what medication it needs to take. We know that they need to rest. We know that they need to drink a lot of tea. We know that they need to be like inside, out of the cold. But there's a problem in that we don't make the decisions for the Lama. There are other people who make the decisions, and those people are not doctors. Those people might be politicians, oligarchs and businessmen, diplomats, or religious leaders, right? So if we are a doctor friend who wants our Lama to live, we have to try to influence the people who have power over the Lama. And in the same way, if we're peace-building professionals, and we know from practice and research that there are certain things that would be good, that would benefit the context and kind of the health of the society, oftentimes we don't have the power to intervene directly in the context. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we have to work through people who have power, right? And so when we're thinking about transfer, we have to also be thinking about how are our dialogues built to try to influence the decision-making processes of these people who have power over the Lama's health. So two things that we can think about are theories of change and mechanisms of transfer. So theories of change is how is it that we think our dialogue can impact the context? So let's say there's peacemaking dialogue. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just one or two examples, right? So a theory of change for peacemaking dialogue is if we recruit as high-ranking, influential participants as we can, people who the decision makers trust, if they come to the dialogue and if they are transformed, they go back and they talk to the decision makers, the negotiators, they might impact the peace process. That is a theory of change. It might not be correct, but if we have some kind of theory of change, then we can design the dialogue process to better position itself to have an impact. With a reconciliation dialogue, maybe it's we want to involve as many people as possible in one village that's divided after war. So with the peacemaking dialogue, where we're trying to influence the peace process, we might try to recruit the most influential people and have like 4 dialogues a year, like once every 3 months. so that they can build trust and we can really get into the issues and there could be some kind of transformation and so on and so forth, right? For the reconciliation dialogue, maybe we want to have as many short dialogues as possible to try to bring in as many people as possible in this village, so that as many people as possible are transformed. And then eventually there might be a critical mass of people who have been through the dialogue process that they make some kind of change in their community. That's another kind of theory of change. Maybe with peace building dialogue, we have very concrete goals, right? Maybe we want to change the curriculum in schools to try to create like a common narrative of history. So we might say, okay, we're going to have a dialogue that has to do with teachers. And we're going to only have teachers. We're going to have like lots of teachers from all across the board, or the superintendents of schools, right? Or we're going to have conferences of the people who, or dialogues with people who write curriculums or textbooks, the publishers, right? Or maybe if our goal is to change media practices so that's less polarizing, we might involve people who are journalists, who are producers, like people who are in charge of media empires, things like that, right? So the theory of change is an understanding of how our dialogue might lead to change in the greater context. So that's our idea of how we get from A to B, right? And there are some people create their own theory of change. Other people kind of look to other practitioners who have written about their experiences and said, this is a theory of change that worked for me, or I tried this theory and it didn't work for me, right? So there's a large literature about this. And there are many, this is where case studies are really important, where we try to figure out why something might have worked and why, although this is like not science, right? This is very imprecise. But if you hear about a certain theory of change that worked well, you might get inspired, be like, oh, I'm going to try to build my dialogue so it better matches that because I want to do something similar. So this is something, again, to keep in mind as we're designing our dialogues. And the second part are mechanisms of transfer. So these are the concrete ways that that the dialogue stuff goes from A to B. So for example, the personal context of participants, meaning how connected is a participant to people in power or people of influence. So recruiting people who have the ear of people in power. Maybe the participants are public figures, right? Like celebrities or social media influencers. They have an audience. Or maybe we want to gather religious leaders, right? Because they have access to a lot of different people in their churches or mosques or synagogues. So we want to recruit, the transfer mechanism is that there's a person who has an audience. So if they are impacted by the dialogue, they might change their discourse with people in their community. There's a question from Masha. When we recruit participants for the dialogue, do we inform them about our transfer ideas? What if nobody agrees to make the transfer themselves? Some people do, some people don't. So again, it depends on your context. So if we want to, if there's a very sensitive dialogue and it's very hard to convince people to come to the dialogue in the first place, maybe telling them about the transfer mechanisms ahead of time is going to make it seem more crazy and make it harder to recruit them. So some people might not choose that. They might just say, we just want to talk. But in the facilitator or the convener's mind, they hope, or they have the transfer mechanism in their head, not knowing if it's going to work or not. In these kinds of dialogues with the same people over time, oftentimes there's a very honest discussion about, like, after there was this transformative moment where people are like, yeah, we have to do something together. That's often when we start talking about transfer with the participants. Like, okay, so what can we do? Oh, there are these different things that we can do. Maybe we want to invite certain people that will better fit our transfer mechanism to like participate in the dialogue. So depending on the process, some facilitators or conveners or practitioners, the participants are actively involved in transfer. But for example, if you have reconciliation dialogue, maybe people don't care about the greater impact. They just want to process their own trauma and to bring in this conversation of, oh, like if you work with your trauma, it'll change the village. Like some people might be open to that. Some people might just be like, oh, like I don't care, right? I care about me. When we did our project in Calgary, we were 100% transparent with our transfer. We're like, this is what we would hope to do. that can be risky because if you don't get a result, people might be disappointed, right? So again, these are all choices depending on what your values are and what your priorities are. And depending on how transparent you are, it might create complications or it might not. So again, it all depends. And I don't want to say you should do this or that, rather than these are things that can be thought about. And these are things where you should make a choice. And your choice is going to depend on your priorities and your values. So thank you, Masha, for the question. Other kinds of transfer mechanisms, like maybe participants are going to go on to serve as experts, like maybe on a panel afterwards, or in a commission on like human rights abuses after conflict. Maybe there's going to be after the end of the dialogue, you're going to produce some kind of document. Like maybe there's something that the participants are going to collectively work on together. That's going to be policy recommendations. Maybe there's going to be a speech on behalf of the people who are in the dialogue. Maybe participants just share the dialogue results in their own circles and their own families. There could be social media content where you try to share certain things from the dialogue. Maybe the participants go on to be guests on podcasts, try to get some kind of voice. Maybe they go on to create events in local institutions to say, I was participating in this, and these were the things we talked about, right? Maybe participants go on to recruit other participants for a new dialogue, right? So these are all different mechanisms of transfer. And there's, again, lots of other ones that you could talk about, but it's basically like, these are all different ways that your dialogue is trying to have some kind of impact or influence on the society at large, if that's what you want. So yeah, this is basically the same thing I was talking about before, but just kind of in a more fancy chart. So maybe there are different mechanisms associated with your participants, who they are. Like, so you would have to recruit them in a particular way. Maybe there's going to be a report, and maybe the facilitator is going to make the report. Maybe the report is something that all the participants work on, and then you have to dedicate certain time in the dialogue to reach some kind of consensus, and then to figure out where you're going to send it. And there has to be work afterwards to send it to places where you think it's going to be relevant. Or maybe there's just like social media content where you just try to share, get it shared and for it to go viral, right? So there are different aspects that are going to affect how you design it. So an example is a dialogue that I've spoken about with some of you before, where in Canada, there was a protest where truckers came to Ottawa, the capital city, and there was a big protest for almost a month. And we did a dialogue between the supporters and the opponents of this protest. It was called the Freedom Convoy, and there were 5 exercises that we did. But if you look in the middle row on the bottom, the final exercise was, what's one thing the other side could say or do that would build trust or give me more hope? So I designed this exercise in a way that the people would share their thoughts, but when they shared the thoughts, we would the things that they would say would basically go on to form a list of recommendations that then could be shared broadly. So we took these recommendations. So one column is recommendations for the protesters. The column on the right is recommendations for the counter protesters, and the recommendations in the middle were for both sides. And this turned into social media content that we then shared after the dialogue. And I created a report that then we sent to different people. But like the way that you design the dialogue can be done in a way that makes it easy to produce a certain kind of transfer. And usually the more successful dialogues are the ones that are designed with transfer in mind, depending on what it is that you want to do. Sometimes you designed it perfectly and the transfer still goes nowhere, right? So there's always a risk. But when you design with transfer in mind, it increases the chances that you might have some kind of impact. Yeah, so questions about the application to violent contexts or anything that we've talked about so far? Or maybe if you've been involved in dialogues yourself, you might think about, if you want to share something about how you've engaged with these kinds of things, or maybe there's something different that we haven't talked about that you want to share. Now is a time for discussion. Brief discussion before we talk about cases. No. Okay. So then the last part of today, I'm sure they were starting to get tired, is examples of dialogues that have worked or that have not worked or that have just existed somewhere. And following these cases, we can open it up for a broader discussion. So I talked about it before. There is a movie called Endgame. We watched it with some of the folks in this room a month ago, and we discussed it. This is a peacemaking dialogue in South Africa. It involved secret elite level participants, dialogue between the ANC, which is the African National Congress, which was a group that was doing resistance to the white apartheid regime. Nelson Mandela was a leader here. The dialogue was between members of that group and academics and public leaders on the white Afrikaner side. These dialogues happened over time, and they gradually overcame skepticism and led to negotiations that ended apartheid. And it was facilitated by businessmen who literally his company wanted a more stable South Africa. And so this was actually led by the private sector. There is a question. Masha, you weren't able to ask the question. There's more questions here. Masha said you didn't. Okay, so we will have a moment in about 5 minutes to answer more questions. So if you have questions, put them in the chat. Natasha also had a question in the chat. Let's go through the cases, and then we can go to the questions, if that's okay with you guys, because then we can end this faster. But we will get to these questions. So yeah, this is one example of a successful case that ended not necessarily a war, but a repressive regime and the resistance to it. Mozambique was a civil war, and it also ended because there was a track 2 dialogue that involved secret elite level groups, but representing the government and the rebel groups. It led to official negotiations and the signing of a peace agreement. It was facilitated by a Catholic dialogue NGO called Sant'Egidio. So it was a religious group that was the conveners, because both sides had some kind of respect for the church, and so that gave them a certain leverage over both sides. If you notice, oftentimes the peacemaking dialogues involve these secret elite level groups. And that's a pattern that, if you go through the cases, is definitely there for a lot of them. Colombia is a bit of an exception. So between 2010 and 2012, it was a secret elite level dialogue. But then after 2012 to 2016, it was a public elite dialogue. But it was with public dialogues that involved broader segments of society. So there was the track 1. So it started with track 1.5, which is secret dialogue between people in power. Then it was public negotiation on track 1, plus dialogue on the track 2 and the track 3 levels that were all connected to each other. So Colombia is actually an example of like really, really interesting and good design. So for example, there were dialogues that involved conflict affected people about reform, like land reform, also the drug trade, but also victims. So there was dialogue that involved victims on each side. And even sometimes people from those dialogues were sent to track 1 in Havana, in Cuba, and they spoke in front of the negotiation team about their experience as a victim. So that's a very rare case of track 3 influencing track 1. Sometimes that happened as well. Oftentimes that's the golden thing. A lot of people want track 3 to influence track 1 and not just track 2 to track 1. So this led to a failed referendum. So they put together a peace deal, asked it to the Colombian people in a referendum. The Colombian people said, no, we don't want this deal. So then the government rewrote the deal a little bit and then just passed it. So this was a much more inclusive example of peacemaking than the Mozambique and the South Africa one. And there's lots of interesting literature about this, because it's almost 10, it'll be 10 years next year. So yeah, I was in Colombia that year while this was happening, and it was very, very interesting to talk to people. So again, Israel and Palestine, we talked about this. Again, elite level secret dialogues. But one of the reasons why it failed was that it had elite buy-in, but it didn't have track 3 buy-in. So the deal was signed, but people, one of the narratives about why this failed was because the people rejected it. So even though there was like 12 years of dialogue before the pen hit the paper and the deal was signed, like you don't just want elite buy-in, you need to have regular people bought in to the peace deal for it to last. So another example of reconciliation dialogue is reconciliation dialogue in Rwanda after the genocide. So there were public dialogues where perpetrators and victims, which were sometimes the same people, collectively processed the genocide together. There was an interesting practice called the gacaca courts, which was also a transitional justice mechanism where, for example, people would tell the truth about what they did in exchange for not going to jail, right? But there were also dialogues where people would kind of like basically talk with their neighbors, like processing what was going on. Maybe there would be dialogue between like perpetrators and victims. Like there was lots of different things that were going on, and they were organized by lots of different groups. There were NGOs, local NGOs, international NGOs, church leaders, community leaders, government officials. There's all sorts of people that were doing different kinds of reconciliation dialogue all at once. So it was a really big deal. There's also lots of interesting things that were written about it. Bosnia and Herzegovina, public dialogues aimed at inter-ethnic contact, identifying root causes of the war, and understanding how other groups suffered. I know that the Nansen Center was really involved in different forms of reconciliation and peace-building dialogue in the Balkans for many years. Maybe Narun would be able to tell us a bit more about this during the discussion period. Again, facilitated by both locals, but also foreign NGOs. Peace-building. So between 2014 and 2022, there was a very active community of dialogue facilitators that were basically trying to deal with the consequences of the conflict and prevent bigger conflict from happening, which failed, unfortunately. But their dialogues focused on integrating displaced persons into their communities, because sometimes when you had displaced persons in your community, there were lots of tensions. So there's dialogues that were only focused on this. There were also lots of dialogues focused on veterans. So veterans would come home and there might be different issues. And so there were dialogues that were meant to address that. One of the government changes was that certain kinds of power would be decentralized from like the central power in Kiev to different regional governments. And so there were dialogues about how to best to do that. And so this is initially facilitated by international NGOs, but more and more as the years went on, facilitated by local facilitators. So I heard a story from Steinar from the Nansen Center for Peace and Dialogue about peace building dialogue in Croatia. If I'm remembering it correctly, it was a dialogue that was meant to that was aimed at the school system to try to introduce a common curriculum in segregated schools. So again, that's a very like focused kind of dialogue. Dialogue can also not be about the peace deal or about the conflict. It can also be technical over technical issues. So an example in Iran, so there's an Iran nuclear deal, and there was basically like a track 2 that was bringing together influential people from the West and from Iran to try to influence the negotiations for the nuclear deal. This was in 2015, I think. In Ukraine, 2 or 3 years ago, there were negotiations and dialogues that were about trying to create the grain deal. So trying to find an agreement between Ukraine and Russia, not to end the war, but to allow for ships carrying grain to leave through the Black Sea. So there was dialogue that was limited to this technical issue that was also successful in this way. A colleague of mine was involved in dialogue in Jerusalem, again, not to end the conflict, but to figure out how to share and allocate water in a more just and equitable way among Israelis and Palestinians. So again, you can take the track 1, track 2, track 3 model and not think about the conflict as a whole, but also about little problems that are not little problems, they're not necessarily little, but particular problems where you only focus on one thing. If you can't reach the peace deal, maybe there are other little things that you can do that can mitigate the suffering. So that is it from me. So yeah, that's the last slide. So now we can take a few minutes to discuss, maybe just 10 or 15 minutes maximum, because we've been here already for a while. Do we want to continue the recording during the conversation, or should we end the recording now?
As far as I'm concerned, we can keep the conversation for sure. As in, keep recording.
Does anybody not want the conversation to be in the recording?
Maybe we can have a few minutes on the recording and then we can stop and then.
Yeah, exactly. And then if anyone wants to share something sensitive, it won't be on the recording. Great. So let's start then with the questions in the chat. So first from Nitaha, it seems that it's not any person that can be a representative of one of the representatives of one of the groups at the negotiations. Maybe I didn't hear, but I would like to know you like one more time. I'd like to hear one more time. What kinds of qualities a person should have who's participating in negotiations, but not one of the people who like take a decision. So like who is the question to talk about who should we recruit for like a track 2 style dialogue or
it's a question about maybe I want to be one side of in the dialogue of second track, and I need to be honest with the other side when what I can and feel boardings of my я не знаю, как это сказать, но мне кажется, этот человек должен чувствовать как-то границы и понимать ситуацию очень хорошо. И, в общем, не очень понятно, на самом деле, как выбрать такого человека, потому что у каждого человека есть свое мнение, и, может быть, он недостаточно хорошо понимает те процессы, которые происходят на уровне выше, и поэтому не может достаточно правильно представить другую сторону.
Вот. So it's a question about like the qualities of the person who's participating in track 2. Maybe you want to recruit somebody who has like a good understanding or like might have certain qualities, like they might understand with nuance, but maybe a person might not be the one who's like best able to represent the group, or maybe they don't have the ear of the somebody. I'm adding my own stuff to your question, Natacha, but it's about how do we properly recruit somebody, and like what do we like, who do we pick? So there's a lot of stuff written about this in the literature. Like, for example, it would be easy to recruit people from different sides who already want peace, but maybe those people who want peace aren't very close to the people in power. So a lot of us work within the Russian context, and it's very easy to recruit Russian people to have dialogue, but not necessarily, those people might not necessarily have any influence on the government right now. Right? Or the people who have influence in government, they might be really hard to recruit. About the question of what kinds of awareness of like boundaries, what their boundaries should be, what they can or cannot talk about. Maybe a person is recruited before they become the perfect person. But over the course of the dialogue, they might start to understand that, oh, it's worth it to think about XYZ. Or it's worth it to start talking about this differently. Or, oh, I used to really have this narrative, but now that I've had this encounter with the other side, I realize that it's much more complicated than that. So sometimes it's the facilitator who has to do a lot of the heavy lifting. Tata says, thank you. I'm too tired to stay. I will leave, but if it's recorded, I will watch the recording. So thank you to Tata for staying with us. Yes. Does that answer your question, Natacha? Obviously, your question is like very broad, but those are just some immediate thoughts.
Yes, thank you.
Masha.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, great, thank you. It's a bit hard for me to ask a question, to formulate what I'm going to ask what I'm going to ask about. It's like I wonder who have the power to organize dialogues, like who are the donors, and when you were talking about this first track dialogue,
yeah,
and even and first and a half and even second, I was always thinking like, how well I cannot reach these people. Like, is like, okay, I'm not a facilitator of a dialogues, and you are. So maybe you can share something about like who has this power and how do you recruit people? Do those who pay for dialogue, for example, who organize it, maybe recruit this high-level people or something like this? Because for me, all of this sounds like very interesting, maybe even inspiring, but also a bit frustrating because I don't understand what can I do about it other than speak with people who have no influence on decision makers. You know, like an organized dialogue between people who still don't have influence over decision makers.
Thanks, Masha. Dasha, did you have something you wanted to respond? Did you want to respond to Masha's question? No? Okay.
No, it's enough there.
Yeah. So 100%, I feel you about the frustration. It never ends. So when I was studying like peace and conflict studies, we looked at lots of cases about like how people have done different things, right? And track one, peace deals are the sexy thing that everyone wants to get in on. And there are like so with the South African one, it was a person who represented a business interest that was connected to both sides. And so they had contact on both sides. And because there was a lot of money involved, they could incentivize them to the table, right? For Mozambique, like the church already had contacts, like in all the churches on both sides, you know, so they already had some kind of way in. And oftentimes people will start a dialogue at a lower level to gain the trust of people at the next level, to gain the trust of the people at the next level, right? So that might be your theory of change. We're going to start small. Like when I was talking to Steinar, who's one of the facilitators at Nansen, it was like they would just start in a village with whoever would come. And they would hope that as time went on, like the reputation of the dialogue would grow and could involve people from the municipality, journalists, people of influence in the community. So like there are different ways of doing that. For me, one of the reasons why I wanted to do this presentation was not to talk about track one and track two, because most of us don't work at that level. I wanted to talk about transfer. And this actually had to do with when we were doing the presentation or when we had the conversation about the movie last time. Like I find that transfer is such an important thing to talk about, like within dialogue. And at least within the Russian speaking community that I work in, like transfer, nobody thinks about transfer. It's like a piece of peace building theory and dialogue theory that is not common knowledge. When thinking about transfer seems to be really important, especially in our context, you know, and thinking about who we want to work with and like what impact we want to have, what are different mechanisms. So really that's this presentation was like a Trojan horse to talk about transfer. But to talk about transfer, you might also want to give the context of how this was developed. There's different tracks. People try to influence different tracks. So I'm also deeply frustrated at my own powerlessness. Yeah. And so I work mostly at the track 3 level. And at times when I'm invited to do something, so when we're invited to do the stuff in Calgary, we had a mandate from the city to have those dialogues. So we were given access immediately. So we could work across all 3 levels because we were given the power to do so. And my impression is some people are mandated to do dialogues in the context of war by the UN, or so like they're given a mandate, or they create the mandate and they get buy-in from the people. They convince people. So from what I understand, for a lot of people, the more of the work of dialogue is done before the dialogue to create the legitimacy and to recruit people. And then once you're at the dialogue itself and you have people at the table, then you already have done so much work. Yeah, so we were given the mandate to work in the city across all 3 levels. But when I was doing the convoy dialogue, it was immediately at track 3. there was no mandate for anything, but we created a report, and then I was sending it out to different people as a way of trying to see if we can get this somewhere. It didn't, like, I didn't develop the proper networks so that I could do that. Like, some people are embedded in a community for so long, they already have those connections. But this was like a month-long protest that happened very fast. But actually, we got the report in front of a former prime minister of Canada. Like, that was the highest that it went. And like, the protest ended, you know, so it didn't, like, before, like, so we didn't have a really, really big impact, I would say. Actually, no, like, the impact, the biggest impact was then I was taken on by Ottawa Dialogue to be part of the team. They were impressed with that, and so, like, okay, let's work with you. So, like, that was a cool thing, but it didn't have as much reach as we wanted, because we were trying to do it just spontaneously. So yeah, like, those are some of my thoughts. Norun, do you have anything to say on this question? Because I know that you guys have your own experience as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. I found this really, really interesting. I think we are not, what to say, that much consciously putting these different ways of working into these kind of boxes, but we are working on many different fields, and I think we have something to learn about that. And one takeaway for me would be to go back to my colleagues, and also to look more closely into what kind of situations is our approach suitable for. Because this Nansen approach to dialogue and conflict transformation is a bit different from other approaches, and it does work in different contexts, and very different contexts actually. But yeah, so we could look more into that. What I'm right now, what my concern is about this thinking of in terms of dilemmas in dialogues, because there are always dilemmas. It's also a dilemma if you should use a dialogue approach or something else. What kind of consequences would the different choices that you make have? And asking this question. And when it comes to this, the question of transfer, I have now been the last days thinking a lot about this. When we provide the safe space in the dialogue, then and of course then people are going out of this safe space. We are creating a really safe and nice space for people who have been fighting before, maybe, or at least being very much into conflicts. And then, but what about our responsibility for what happens when they get out of the space? And that is getting out into the real world, and then trying to make the changes that they want to see. So this is something, I think, the dynamics between the safe space that we provide and the world outside is really important to work on. And the way we work is very much that we, in a way, we have this saying, follow the flow. So we see in a way what happens, and then we try to what to say, to design the process as it goes, as from what we see and from the needs of the participants. Because of course it can be like a paradox if we provide a space that is so safe that it creates problems when people get out of the space. Because they can also be seen as traitors. They can be seen as someone who are not what to say, who are not anymore supporting who they did support, and all these kind of things that can on a personal level be really challenging. So how we can support in this process, I think, is really, really important. And that also is something with the commitment that we have to stay in it long enough so that people have the support that they really need when they want to make the changes, because we're not making the changes. The people that we are working with are making the changes. Yeah, so these are some of my reflections, but I really want to study your presentation even more if you send it to us, and then I'm sure I have a lot of more questions too. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
In the literature, this is called the problem of reentry. So this is also something that people have studied and kind of recorded like different thoughts on. Dasha.
Yeah, I actually have to go, but I'm still gonna Yeah, and I think what Narun said as well refers to that. I think for me, a lot of these questions, no, how can I put this? It's like idealist versus realist politic. And also the question about the neutrality of the facilitator, that's also idealist versus realist. And it also brings me back like just to this data feminism course that I'm also taking, and like the whole AI thing, because we reproduce in the AI the mechanisms, all the repression stuff, it's built in. So the question is like whether we want an AI or the facilitator be the one who is, facilitating the change or just following what is already there. And I think to me, this is probably why I have still stick to the dialogue and the facilitation, is because I see this as something which might be as a normative, which might have this goal in mind and like value-based, not like a neutrality. And I think this is about change making in a way. Yeah, what I wanted to bring is that I have to think about these questions of like, do we really make a change? Are these track 1, 2, 3, and 1.5 are they really actually connected to each other after all, or it's just a nice, idealist picture for us that we can influence this from here? And I mean, I'm an idealist and I like this, but when I'm facing reality and the reality is just crushing me, I have to think whether my theories actually relate to the reality. Can we implement them? And if we can build a future which is based on these ideals or in these theories of change, yeah, maybe we have to take some stands. Yeah, and like the transfer, I think the question of transfer mechanisms and theories of change is the crucial for me now, with, also back to some other discussions that we have on the liberal peacemaking versus some other ones. Yeah, sorry, it's not really a well-formulated question, more like a throw in a lot of thoughts.
So
Yeah.
one thing that when you're talking about like the AI, like if we just write it in the way that we think, like we're going to build in the different bullshit that we have in our society. This is also something we can say about track 2. So Ottawa Dialogue, the organization in Canada I'm connected with, they specialize in track 2. So one of the dialogues that they do is between retired generals in India and Pakistan. And they have the ear of the current generals and the military apparatus in each country. And they have dialogues about what to do about Kashmir. And they don't have dialogues about how to resolve the conflict. They have dialogues about how do we not go to nuclear war. So their dialogues are about keeping the destructiveness down, but it's not about resolving the conflict. And so it's actually just about keeping the status quo with all of its problems. So certain kinds of dialogues reproduce and maintain like a bad status quo, right? They might prevent more violence, but like there's a lot of challenge. There's some people that say this kind of track 2 is bullshit. We need something that's more transformative, right? Like we talked about in another conversation about the difference between conflict management, which is like just making sure the conflict isn't getting more violent, conflict resolution, trying to find a win-win, and then conflict transformation, changing the structural background to make the conflict like redundant, right? So again, like a lot of track 2s are this conflict management, right? And some of the, like when Dash was talking, it sounds a lot more like conflict transformation. We have to understand like these underlying structural like things that are affecting the conflict. But people who are doing practice for one or the other, they can also go into conflict. Again, we're talking about the goals, right? Like if your vision of peace is a ceasefire, not caring what happens next, or if your piece is about also including gender-based violence or like racial violence or XYZ, like you're going to be thinking about completely different things for your dialogue. And like so there's lots of stuff to talk about here, but yeah, there's some kinds of dialogue that are seen as maintaining a destructive status quo, or like as long as the dialogue is maintaining the current system, there's there's less incentive to think about a new system or work towards a new system. So this is also really important. So it's 8:30 over here in Tbilisi time. So we've been here for 2 hours. So this is probably a good moment to wrap things up. Is there any other questions or comments that we can kind of, as we close out, before we go?
I'm just going to say thanks from my side. It's been quite interesting listening to you guys, quite enlightening. And Josh, I mean, we're going to meet tomorrow. We're going to have an opportunity to speak a little more. And for me, it's a lot of information here to take home and a bunch of stuff to learn. So for me, that's part of a journey, and I'm very grateful. I happen upon you and upon what you're doing and upon you guys to sort of expand my horizons in this area. So yeah, just a general comment here from my side, and I'm happy to be part of this.
Great.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
So yeah, thank you everybody for coming. I was very happy to nerd out about all these things that I like nerding out about. I hope that you have a good rest of the evening. Go like eat dinner or some ice cream or watch some cartoons or walk a dog or something. And who knows, maybe we'll do something like this again sometime. So
Thank
have
you.
an excellent evening.
Talk to you soon. Have a good one, guys. Bye.
Bye.